Welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 199th New Social Environment. I'm Catherine Olson, Director of Advertising at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation between Charles Ray and Toby Kamps. We're also thrilled to have the poet Robert Fitterman here, who will read to close today's program. We'd also like to thank Hill Art Foundation for supporting today's conversation. You can find out more about their current exhibition and education programs through the links in the chat. To begin, I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation, the traditional owners of Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters on which we stand. Finally, the Brooklyn Rail stands in solidarity with the uprisings in response to the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Nina Pop, David McAtee, James Scurlock, Jamel Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Rashard Brooks, Raya Milton, Dominique Remy Fells, Toyin Salau, Walter Wallace Jr., and countless others we have lost to white supremacy and police violence in this country, and we acknowledge that justice will come from the streets, from the nation demanding accountability and refusing to move on until Black Lives Matter in the eyes of the state. Before I introduce our host, we'd like to begin with a brief moment of silence. Thank you. And now to introduce today's host, Toby Kamps is the Director of External Projects at White Cube Gallery and is an editor at large for the Brooklyn Rail. Without further ado, Toby, take it away.
Great. Thanks, Catherine. I want to thank you, Fong Bui, and the entire Brooklyn Rail team for your help pulling this event together and for the New Social Environment series, your extraordinary creative effort to find a way through these crazy times. I also want to thank our guest artist today, Charlie Ray, and his assistant, Morgan Canavan, for their help gathering images and ideas for the conversation today. Charlie Ray can talk and think about sculpture like nobody else. His whole body gets involved as he describes how something is made and how it uses space, one of the main materials in his own work. He ranges widely and freely, reaching back into the history of art from antiquity to the present and into his own childhood memories and esoteric philosophies to describe how a sculpture works, how it addresses the viewer and makes a place and time, another of his favorite materials and subjects. In an astonishing series of lectures at the Manil Collection in Houston in 2015, he described how, among other things, you could throw a cell phone through a hole in a Henry Moore bronze work, but how it would bounce off the negative space in a stainless steel David Smith sculpture, because Smith built with space in such a powerful, integral way. And I think it's fair to say his own projects have similar force fields. Ray's own sculptures, which incubate in his mind and in his studio for tantalizingly long periods before they enter the world, are, as the artist acknowledges, both what they represent, their subject matter, and something entirely different. A stainless steel sculpture of a young man is both that specific young man and a mind-bending exegesis on matter, mass, gravity, and the many ways art can tangle and unwind the mortal coil. They are extraordinarily crafted using a variety of advanced technologies and teams of highly skilled fabricators, and they are embedded, to use the term that's important for this artist, in the physical space of our world and animated by physical and intellectual tours de force. No detail is left unconsidered, and every effort seems to have been made to prepare the work both for its first encounters with an engaged audience and for a journey into perpetuity and the unknown of the future. Charlie Ray has been the subject of major solo exhibitions at the Reina Sofia in Madrid in 2019, the Art Institute of Chicago and the Kunstmuseum Basel in 2015, and the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Museum of Contemporary Art Los Angeles, and the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago in 1998. He's shown in 5 Whitney biennials, which might be a record, and his work is in important museums and private collections around the world. He was born in Chicago in 1953 and received his BFA from the University of Iowa in 1975 and his MFA from the Mason Gross School of Art, Rutgers University in 1979. He lives and works in Los Angeles, where he's joining us from today. So, hi, Charlie.
Hi.
Thanks for joining us. I wanted to start the conversation by this, what you call the Pneuma Chicago Tornado card. You sent this out in the mail maybe 3 months ago, and I thought it was an extraordinary document. Maybe we can show the first slide, please. It is as I understand it, it's a graphic representation of wind and pressure, and maybe reading the text on the other side can tell you a little bit more about it. Can we go to the next slide, please?
This first page is from a paper. Oh yeah, this will say it in the if you read the text.
A paper, yes. So we battled a little bit about who would read the text, and I will give it a stab. This map is from a paper authored by Tetsuya Fujita in 1961. Dr. Fujita is the F in the designation of tornado strengths, F1 through F5. The paper describes an F2 storm that I witnessed as an 8-year-old in Chicago. In 1960, my family moved to the suburbs. Before we moved, I became friendly with a young married couple from Chicago's South Side where we lived. The lady had lost an arm to cancer, and this was the aspect of my friendship that intrigued me. I was too young not to ask 1,000 questions. How did it happen? How do you get dressed? How do you cook and then do the dishes, etc., etc.? She would answer all my questions and show me her techniques at the stove and sink. In retrospect, I think her interest in me had to do with the fact that she could not have children and that her condition was terminal. She died a year or two after the event I'm writing to you about. I went for a sleepover at the young couple's. I've just moved the. Sorry, I have to. I have lost the. Here. I went for a sleepover at the young couple's apartment during a spring weekend. Their apartment was back in the old neighborhood, and the streets and stores were all very familiar to me. The husband and I went out around 5 p.m. to buy ice cream for dessert after dinner. We were in a neighborhood ice cream parlor on 71st Street. I remember that he also bought me an ice cream cone. I was happy and did not pay much attention when the sky outside turned green. The adults all around me showed concern. We were moved to the back of the store away from the glass windows facing 71st Street. I remained unconcerned and happy with my ice cream cone. When we left the store after a few minutes, everything seemed normal but displaced. I noticed the car was upside down. The pumps at the corner gas station were interesting because the mechanics were exposed. An apartment next to my old house looked like a dollhouse. The front wall was ripped off, exposing the living rooms of all 3 floors. The normalcy of the events of the storm, the one-armed lady, and my weekend visit have always stayed with me. While thinking about Pneuma, I came across Dr. Fujita's paper. Figure 6 in the document is very beautiful to me as it not only charts the space and time of the storm, but also my memory of the evening. Wind is Pneuma, and the more I think about it, the less I believe there is a last breath. So, Charlie, what is this?
The card?
Yeah.
Well, out of the studio, we run publishing. I'll call Olympic Publications and Olympic Productions. And occasionally, we do a book or produce something. And occasionally I have produced cards, postcards, or just cards that don't mark a special event that, just, I don't think of them as mail art or anything like that, but just there's something, idea or a thought or event that's important to me, and then just send them out. And this is kind of a funny situation because we worked on it you know, it's a memory in my mind that I've, like I said in the little text, the short text, always, you know, always stayed with me, both the storm and my friendship with the lady and her husband. But was kind of, you know, I guess it's connected to the turmoil of the time a little bit with the upcoming election. When I wrote it and put it together. Came across the paper or mid last spring, and then we decided. You know, I was just looking at the chart and thought this would make a beautiful card. So I didn't know how to use it. First, I thought that would be it. It would be just a postcard, and the only reference of the storm would be my memory. But I would just use, you know. Then I wrote this on the inside, and Sylvia Gaspardo-Moro, my wife, thought that would work really well to have the text like a fold-out card. And then it was all finished, and it was at the printers, and we were in the middle of you know, COVID lockdown, and I decided to go on a trip by myself in my car up to Washington State. I was in this horrendous automobile accident, and Morgan, who is helping me today, you know, called up. One of the things my wife said, we can't send out the card when it comes back because it's so related to this event that, you know, this kind of was another kind of storm in a way, like the automobile accident. And but then that passed, and it felt, so there was a delay in sending it out. I had to get better, heal a little bit first, and you know, and that's it.
But it's, you know, you've talked about Pneuma, this kind of life force or breath, about a number of your works, and this seems to be an expansion on that idea. And can you connect this tornado to the breath, for instance, in the work that will be one of the last things we'll talk about, the great Eleusinian relief that you, or a work at the Met where you talk about a pneuma in this gap between a girl and a bird's beak. It's a work at the Met, I believe. Can you talk about pneuma in your work?
Well, it's a little hard to be very specific about it, but you know, it's an idea or concept that you know, I remember from early theology classes in high school, and meaning Pneuma, breath, and also what one means, which is sort of a misinterpretation of fundamentals of the Word of God is really like the breath of God. And you know, in the card, when I say the more I think about it, the less I believe there's a last breath. I'm not meaning that we stay animated or there's an afterlife and we keep, you know, we resurrect and we keep, you know, going along breathing. By Pneuma, I don't mean necessarily us breathing or, you know, the last breath is, I kind of mean the force of animation. You know, there's this thought that if you're on the sea, it's really important to understand that the ocean doesn't know you're there. And in a sense, the force of Pneuma or animation, it doesn't know what it's animating. Things are just animated in it, in this force. And you know, in a sense, that's kind of what I mean. In you know, the way I think of it in different ways at different days too. But
art is long, life is short, maybe something.
We had, I was talking to a friend about this recently. We had, I went to a really kind of tough military school, boarding school, and high school. It was half run by the Fifth Army and half run by the Benedictine monks. And this theology class I was telling you about was run by this guy named Father Wilston, who was just like we called him Grove. He was just a mean-tempered monk, and he would just beat on us for no reason. He just started laying out on you. And so this concept of Pneuma came out of his class, thinking it meaning breath or word connected to the absolute. And there was this kid who on his sweatpants on the ass, he wrote Pneuma. We all thought, holy shit, he's going to get, when Father Wilson sees this kid, he's going to, really get beat up. And they were literally, they knock the breath or the Pneuma out of you when you got beat by these guys. But when he saw it, he says, that's it. That's exactly, you got it right. That's what I mean. So it was a strange moment to kind of understand that, like, human gas, in a sense, could be this Pneuma, this, so there's nothing sacred about it. It's just it's like a force of animation in a way. And of course, there in theology, the word of God isn't like, the words aren't like prison cells as fundamentalists, put it there, animation in a way. It's like an animated force in its interpretiveness and, necessity for, human beings to chart these directions and meanings. But, I did this card really because I was just thinking and came across his paper, and it was the very storm that I had been in. It really was kind of a lively for me to read its entire paper.
You early on, you said that it was difficult for you to write, but now you do a lot of writing and you're really good at it. You've written about a lot of artists, like David Smith, Rodin, Dwayne Hansen, and among many others. But you talked early on about organizing ideas, and you said you weren't good at writing, but some of that thinking maybe translated into sculpture. Can you expand on that?
Writing, I started to write more just because spell check was invented, and so I'm such a bad speller that I could spend, even in spell check, sometimes can't get my word, and it's, I have to, it takes me a long time to get it close enough for spell check to hit it, but at least it makes it possible in a way. I would spend all my time in the dictionary before spell check, just trying to, work my way through the bush of it, kind of, and but I think the relationship to sculpture was just early on. It was a language for me, or a way, the first way I could express myself intellectually, in a way that I could express ideas, or be in the world without flailing my arms in some controlled sense. To say express ideas is the wrong way to put it, because there aren't ideas in my head that pre-exist that I have to express. It's more of a behavior in a way, charting my way through, and putting buoys out. I don't know if that answers the question.
Sorry, guys. I have a Google Voice, and I apologize. It's just I get robocalls, and they go to my computer for some reason. I apologize. I had myself muted. Well, let's go to the next slide, please.
I'm glad you told me that, because I thought you were concerned about what I said.
No, I muted myself because this annoying thing, and you can't pick it up, Google Voice. It just rings on your computer. I thought I have no notifications other than that. So Young Man 2012, can you talk about this sculpture, which is made out of one single, incredibly heavy piece of stainless steel?
Oh, and yeah, it's a solid figure. I guess it's a little bit bigger than life size or around life size, but if you make a figuration in life size, it appears diminished because we live in experiential space, and that is we're always moving slightly around, and it makes you, the space that you occupy, even if you think you're sitting still, is a little bit bigger than your physical body, and so if you make a static object exactly the size of the person, for instance, it appears diminished. But this sculpture, it turned out in stainless really much later. When I began, I didn't know what it would be made out of, and it's not a portrait, but I was friends with the model, and I was kind of intrigued by him and by making a figurative sculpture of him, and that's how it began. And yeah, I guess it was interesting for the model as well, because he told me it was the first time he was naked in a sense in public and in front of another person. I made him be naked, and I had him on a turntable, and I spun him around many times and took pictures and all this. But when he told me that, I said, well, what about, when you're with your girlfriend? And he said, well, I just keep the lights off. And so it's not a portrait of my model by any sense, but it's like it began as being intrigued with him and the contemporariness of him, and the inseparability of the body from the culture around him. And I spent 10 years on the sculpture, and to say that seems, how could that be? Or, what could take so long? Or he really worked away and away at it. And, I have a lot of people who help me and assistants and whatnot. So when I say 10 years, it was just, I'm saying the actual working on it was like a close involvement with it for that period of time. I began it, as I mentioned just now, with those kind of not really clear ideas in my head, just kind of an intuitive relationship to my subject and to making a sculpture. And I had no idea how it would finish, and it went through many kind of different variations of, having arms, having no arms, having a head, being headless, actually being painted, having clothes on it, just many different attempts. But most of the work was in terms of detail and trying. I think when I a few years earlier began a Loom Girl, another work which we're not showing, I saw the potential of a human figure as one, its artfulness or its artiness, it's the fact that it is art, just was over with at the beginning. So if you have a figure, there's no clothes, it's just a traditional figure. I saw it akin to maybe how Judd saw boxes. You can't say Judd's work is about boxes. I can't say per se that I'm a figurative artist. I saw the body as a manifold, in a way, for sculptural events to occur on. I saw the body as a kind of space, and I was working for years on the relationship of like a toenail to his penis or his belly button or what his hair would be like. The hair was maybe the most difficult because the hair was, in a sense, in a weird way, one of the places the soul, the sculpture came out of. And, you know, it was style, but not really. And as soon as you start trying to sculpt hair, you're making stylization, like in a salon they're cutting your hair. And so I remember I made like, with my assistants, a mold of his head, and foam mold, and made it, and then laid clay over it, and I had these kitchen timers and give people like 10 minutes, 6 minutes, 12 minutes, and different times. You had 20 of these heads at any one time in the studio, and they would have to work fast to just try. It took many kind of quick attempts to, then I would just pick one that seemed right. But so this relationship of parts, what was important to me. And I remember I once asked my wife, I said, do you think anyone's even going to notice these details? And she said, no, but the meaning of the work is in the details, in the relationship of the details. And then as I neared completion, I decided to machine the sculpture out of, solid metal, and almost as a cultural hand. It's not my hand sculpting the pieces, it's other people's and my supervision and pushing things in certain directions. And I just let people go, and then maybe take the clay and make it in fiberglass and let another team work on the fiberglass, which is more formal and hard. Then take that, put it back into the computer, come out in clay. So there's all of these slow processes that, the sculpture, in a certain sense, given enough time, it made itself in a way, And then all this attention that I was talking about, when I then made it in steel, it's not bright, shiny, reflective steel, but it has a luster and a reflectivity to it. All these details slid away in a way. And, it's hard to see because we're not looking at details, but I think it slid out of my control, out of my authorship, into a kind of abstraction. Because the details you could no longer track or look at the relationship between them, because they were sliding around on this reflective surface in a way. But I quite, I still like the piece a lot. And, I think it's one of my more political works. I look at it today, and again, this is not a portrait, but, it is through my subject to get to the cultural ground in a way. And I look at it and say, well, this is why Trump's in office. It's maybe harder to talk about, but I think in a way you can see it in a sense. I mean, Trump's not in office because he's an asshole, He's in office because our culture put him in office.
I can speculate on that, certainly. When I visited the studio a few years ago, you talked about works like this tumbling into space. And I remember being really struck by that. And I sort of had a kind of like mystical vision of something kind of, ascending into some other world. But I think you meant something slightly more literal, like literally tumbling, like a rock in a polishing machine or something. But can you talk about that idea of tumbling into time? I hope I said tumbling into time.
Yeah, you said you tumbling into space.
I meant tumbling into time. Sorry.
Yeah, I was interested in how work disassociates itself from authorship and how it tumbles out away from the meaning, like all of what I've just said about this work. I'm also interested how those are the first things that will leave this work, and then what are you left with, as this work tumbles away from you, or any work, not this work, tumbles away. You're left, I think, with what's artful about the piece. You're left with a kind of meaning machine, I sort of was talking about its ability to leave my authorship.
So you said earlier, you said the work makes itself, and in a way, you try to set it up to take care of itself too. Is that fair to say?
So conscious, it's not such a controlled thing that I'm setting up, and it's not like a program. It's more, I think, what an artist, not me, but what an artist allows to occur, in work, and
That's interesting, because museums and galleries and the whole system is now, to perpetuate and to reinforce the critical scaffolding around works of art. That's, archives. That's the mission of that. And you've used the term geological time. In X hundred or 1,000 years, that will all have perished, and we're left with the thing itself. It may be at the bottom of the ocean and hauled up.
Maybe sooner, in a way. I think even in years, months, days, work starts to relieve the topical, and find its artfulness in a way. What's artful about a work is, I think, what's interesting about it. And it's not to say that cultural aspects aren't formal elements of a work, and don't leave it in a way, but relationships in it are, and its relationship to viewers is interesting, and I think different from year to year, moment to moment. Certainly decade to decade, to century to century. Some urgency has changed in a given work, I think.
Can we have the next slide, please? In preparing for this conversation, I was looking at your website, which is a fantastic resource for anybody interested in your work. It's very straightforward. It has a list of all works, and you can get information, and it's oftentimes a good text on the works. And I notice a number of works having to do with sleep, and that seems to be a recurring theme. And this is an early work. I can't read the date again, but I wasn't familiar with this. So maybe you could talk about this early work and sleep, which is the subject of the next work we'll show too.
I like to think of the last figure going to bed in this, laying down. But that was my bed, and I suppose an unmade bed is a metaphor for art in a certain sense. But I slept in that bed, and I think it, in retrospect, it's a little thick, in terms of its sculptural equation, huh? Like interior space, exterior space, with with the pillow on top of the box, or the rarefied space of sleep, the softness of the bed, the brittleness of the glass. I mean, these are all kind of maybe more interesting for me in terms of, but they're a little sentimental sculpturally, huh? And the ideas are but when I made it, I was thinking of laying down on it and breaking it. was the impetus in a way of, and I had made a lot of work that actually was kind of held in tension and would collapse and fall over. And it was, in a sense, live, like not performative, but they held a kind of structural event in a way. And I think this was an attempt, an early attempt to take that idea of that event, that sculptural event, and project it in the imagination, you know, project it into the future. So whether it would work that way for a viewer, I'm not sure. But for me, it was attempting to project myself and sleeping on the bed and breaking it.
When I asked for an image of this, you sent along the next slide, another work with a glass sheet or pane in it. And is this what it seems, a glass?
Yeah, this looking down a really long staircase, and because of the lens of the camera, you're catching it about a third of the way down. And if you see in the wall, there's these kind of white minimal pins. It's a second staircase made out of glass that floats above the real staircase, and then actually comes up into the hallway of the staircase, you know, the height of one riser. So, you know, you can kind of feel it in your shins a little bit too. And I think this was much more successful in a sense, or interesting to me than the bed. It had a dialectic and, you know, relationship between the materiality of the glass and its fragileness and architecture, you know, the function of the stairs. You just sort of imagine looking at it tumbling down it, or, you know, but it was very delicate, just kind of floating above the, you can see a reflection of the door, a little bit of the upper door. And is, you know, very psychological too, I suppose.
Of course, glass suggests a kind of membrane being on the other side of something, looking in, and I think you've also spoken about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking in this term of its relationship to the steps through its transparency. You know, so it's not, you know, the steps are not diminished; they're ever present as steps because of the transparency, but also the fragility, like the breakability. I mean, I think I broke panes of this glass just setting the sculpture up. You know, they're slightly bowed. I had bought glass for the risers as well. I was going to silicone the whole thing together and have a more rigid structure, but then allow these pins that I had set up to, you know, just float the panes and allow the kind of bow in the glass to occur. And it's almost like a stopping of time in a way, you know, when at the top of the steps looking down into it. Cinematic as well.
Ghost staircase.
I mean, I say ghost, but I think what was powerful about it was it didn't dissolve into imagery. All right, and so when, like you had just mentioned, ghost staircase, that could be the second staircase floating above the real staircase. But I think the relationship between the glass and the steps actually never dissolved into metaphorical imagery, because you were too scared of being up there, like, you know, being on the edge of a cliff. You have always this sort of desire, what would it be like to jump? Or what if someone pushed me off? What would the fall down be like? You know, or putting your hand on, you know, a hot surface, or this aspect of physical Pneuma, I guess, or, you know, letting go, tumbling down, you know, getting all cut to shreds with this broken glass. And not that you even had to carry it that far into a cinematic gesture. It was really more a constant, non-imagistic, real event occurring in your body as you look down and maybe, you know, had this relationship to I'm trying to say it was turned on in a sense, you know, rather than processed as an image. I mean, it's kind of relationship to architecture and real danger never allowed it really to become an image when you were there. That's what I think was, for me at that time, successful about it.
When you say turned on, do you mean, is that comparable? You've spoken about a number of works that, you know, you think that they will actually kind of switch off when the critical scaffolding around them fades away, but others, because of some intrinsic quality, will persist, will remain switched on. Is that what you mean by switched on?
I mean it, and yes, I mean I understand what you're saying. This I didn't quite mean it that way. I mean I meant that, you know, in the picture I see the ghost staircase in the image, and what I was trying to get at is in real life it never dissolved into an image. It always stayed. You know, there was never a window where you were looking into imagery or a metaphorical situation, you know, like, you know, Cinderella staircase or something, or however you would maybe process in your mind, because the very, you know, looking down this, it was like a 2-story staircase. It was very long and narrow. And, you know, you never had, you know, it was very physical. You know, you don't teetering on the edge of something you don't really have time to consider the metaphorical applications of the situation. It was a situation rather than object in a way, and you as the viewer were intrinsic to that situation.
Let's bookmark that idea, because I think it will maybe come into play as we talk about some other works. And maybe we can go to the next slide, please, which is Mime, another image of sleep, which I did see in the studio. I think it was a fiberglass version. It was just kind of out in a kind of loading dock space, as I recall, like taking a break. And what is going on here?
Do we have that book on the Mime? On the, could you bring it down? So when you saw, what you're talking about is I think you saw the pattern, and by pattern I mean a certain element of a stage of the work where we were working on it. So this piece began by my meeting mimes and talking to mimes and trying to understand what miming was about. And, you know, it came from an idea of, I had another sculpture of sleep that was almost like a geological sleep. And this was a counter to it. And it was more how I sleep. You know, do I pretend I'm asleep so my wife doesn't get worried? Am I really asleep? Do I fake my own self out that I'm asleep? And I was going to have a miming sleep, and or sleeping, you know, a tension that you wouldn't really quite know. And the stage that you saw it in. So I was trying to work like a relief of his painted face. The mask was in a very low relief. The stripes on his shirt kind of came and went, you know, in relief. I was working on all these different aspects of it, but the reason I'm bringing that up, you know, like the pull, the suspender, you know, the clip, how, and these were all in a kind of relationship to its reality. And as I would look down on this fiberglass, for years it was clay, then it was fiberglass. It could have been it may have been plaster and then fiberglass, but fiberglass, I use it as a pattern material, as a just harder material and more formal. Like when you're working with clay, it's very easy to really change something fast, and with fiberglass or plaster, the process is a little slower. It's more, you have to carve away and correct by adding and whatnot. But this figure for years was white and from the fiberglass, or, because we would spray it white to see the form. And I could never pass through the surrealist window of looking. I looked down at this thing sleeping, and it was like looking down at a cloud, this white form. And it was always an image to me. I couldn't understand how to find the reality of not the sleeping mind, but the sculpture, like to bring the sculpture back up through that boundary of image, So it's such an image of this mime sleeping, but then how do you take that and disregard the image of it? That it's not about the image. It's not really about a mime. It's not about an image. It's hard for me to kind of articulate what I'm trying to say. But then one day, because I have worked in Japan with some carvers, it occurred to me, well, if I make this sculpture in wood, in hinoki, the craft of carving, the act of carving, the intentionality of carving, the marks of the chisel, or superimpose on the craft of miming. And there will be a reverberation between the two, and it will break through this aspect of imagery. So this very real relationship, it's not imagistic, between miming and carving will start to carry its relationship to the viewer. And I'll break this window of imagery, of surrealism, if you will, looking down at this sleeping white form. And I did that, but it takes so long for me in Japan to work that in the meantime, it also occurred to me that the robotic arm of the machine was a kind of a craft. And the trail that it left was a sort of hand, if you will, like a contemporary hand, as real in a certain sense as the carver's hand in Japan, in a way. And of course, a robot is only a robot because the homunculus of the robot's a human programmer, right? And so it takes a lot of files to teach the robot how to carve a form like this, where to leave the work, where to come back, and then the robot makes decisions. And but you don't see it in the form because we can't move the camera in, but almost like a CD, that we used to play on the CD player. It has those little lines of the robot's bit crossing over, and the decisions that the robot made about when to leave the work, when to go, what direction to move. The piece is kind of full of that language, or there's across its manifold of its surface, that language is written on the piece, but very subtly, and I think in a certain way, informative and magically, in a way. And so the loom was a similar moment to what I did with the wood. And I tend not to show them together because then people make a decision which one they like better. The wood, he looks frost colored, blah, blah, looks more real. And it was not about the reality of the figure. He is full of breath, etc., and miming. A mime is like a puppet. They go on, they turn on, and it's a puppet, and the puppet who pulls its own strings in a way. there's a beautiful movie of De Cruz from Texas, the Baylor Theater from 1961 that I really recommend. It was a beautiful relationship between miming and sculpture. And De Cruz was a great mime, you could say, is a great mime because of his influence he had on people. But I'm like most people, which our idea of miming is like Marcel. You're just like these French guys on a street, locked in a box or something, which is not really what miming is about. De Cruz thought of Marceau as substituting words in a way. What he did with his body, you could do with a word in a way, and it is coming from another kind of kinesthetic. But
is there something that Mime box, made me flash to the bed slide we just saw? Is there that sort of trapped inside of something? And the mime is the most animated of humans, and to see them inert and deep asleep, of course, is unsettling or unusual.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about how I would talk about this work, and when I made it, my mind was much more simplistic in a way of this projected event. And the only way I could do it, I mean, I think that the staircase is much more successful or much more engaging. I won't say even successful, but more engaging to me after these years, where pretty quickly with this piece, I saw, like I said earlier, the sentimentality. I don't see it so as a mime box, but as two spaces, this rarefied space of the bed and the real space where the pillow is our social space in a way. And how one event in a way could have both. Because of the gestalt, it's still a full bed with the pillow, even though the pillow is floating a little bit above, and the bed, the unmade bed, is in this rarefied space. Pillow is in social space, but like I said, in an event, they're not truly separated.
I think little by little we're getting at the essence of what you call thinking sculpturally, and how this is the title of one of your Minot lectures. Subject matter can itself be a formal element, but talking to you and having seen you give some these Minot lectures, I wonder if you might have something like kinesthesia. If some artists have synesthesia, where a sound or a word or a number makes them see a color, if seeing a sculpture activates your bodily sensorium. I've seen you really physically kind of acting out how something was made, or being in the sculpture, and you talk about almost entering the body of several sculptures, and how you feel transported into them. Do you think that's a fair guess, that you might have something like kinesthesia, if there is such a term?
I don't know. There's certainly, I mean, my sculpturing is a behavior in a way. So it's a way of I've said this before, I think in lecture, that I don't think about sculpture. I think sculpturally, and it sounds, what do you mean by that? But it's, it's like thinking mechanically or thinking engineering. I can see not the world through sculpture, but it's sculptures are not in the world, made from the world. So. I think of, sculpture is a way for me to think about the world. not so much about the imagery of the sculpture that I make. So in this, I'm not really thinking about sleeping or a bed or the staircase. I don't, you know, and years ago I made the that toy fire truck in front of the Whitney, and you know, for years people sent me pictures of fire trucks. I don't really care about fire trucks or horses or, you know, naked male figures, or, you know, it's and they're not excuses to make a sculpture. They're locations in a way to you know. I mean, a great landscape painter maybe doesn't care about his landscape in front of him or her. You know, they care about their painting. Making, that's a, you know, maybe unfair comparison, but I don't, you know, look at sculptures and feel like my body doesn't pull or something, you know.
But you can sort of inhabit the space of them, and you can move from thinking about how they're made to how to perceive them and these sorts of things. And I think that's, it's an extraordinary thing to see as you do this. How you know, you talk about moving around a sculpture, and I see you kind of almost in a sense moving through it sometimes.
Yeah, but that's a quality of my physicality in a way. And I would complain that I would push them off the sidewalk. This is in grade school gesturing, you know, not just, you know, moving around. I think this is much my physicality, and then my work has a physicality. I find it, you know, difficult to separate physicality from the mental. You know, it's like I was saying about the bed. It's hard to separate, you know, what's rarefied and what's you know, in our real space.
Well, let's talk about space, because that is at the heart of your thinking sculpturally, and maybe we could even start with Hinoki, the slide. Yeah, there it is, and maybe you could just kind of set this work up and tell. It's a very well-known work. It's in the collection of the Artists of Chicago. Maybe you could just quickly describe what it is.
Yeah, it's a fallen coastal oak, about, I don't know, 30 feet long, 40 feet with the branch, and I had finished a sculpture that was of a car wreck, and it was in fiberglass, and it took a lot out of me, a long time to figure out how to make it, and called Unpainted Sculpture. And then I was one winter traveling up the West Coast quite a bit in my car for some reasons. And I would pass this place off the highway, not the freeway, but it was off the one. And there was this great fallen oak, you know, I could see it from the road. And I would get out and look at it. And it really intrigued me. So I visited it, I don't know, 3 or 4 times. And it had this great chamber through the middle of it, you know, where the bugs had eaten out the heartwood, which then weakens the tree. And then a storm comes and tips it over. And I was thinking, well, how would I, you know, I was interested in it as a sculpture. And I didn't know how to approach it. You know, how would I find its armature? How would, you know, I deal with it? And for a while, I was thinking of and maybe this is where some of the Pneuma ideas came from, or my talking about Pneuma in a sculptural way. I thought, you know, how would I find the armature of this work? You know, if I was to make a sculpture of it. And maybe this was a literal thinking, because the center of it was howled out, where an armature normally will be. And that's a literal idea of an armature. But everything has an armature. You know, a thought is, you know, its armature is like a wire in the brain, in a way that you start to build, you know, a thought around. And it one day occurred to me, well, this was like 30 years on the ground maybe, and maybe 5 years away from total collapse. The bottom of it was more rotted. It was beginning to fall into the ground. And all these years of bugs and UV and rain and rot. And I thought, well, my armature, my sculptural armature for the piece will be Pneuma in a way. It will be pneumatic. And I had this idea of making a great inflatable, you know, and it would still have this hollow through the middle of it, but it would be quite detailed. And actually went to Nebraska and visited, and it's there where hot air balloons, interestingly enough, were first developed and invented. And they make, you know, some of these companies in Nebraska make the Macy's Day Parade balloons and whatnot. So I spent some time in Nebraska talking and trying to figure out what they would need, what kind of information. I had a lot of pictures of this and what kind of mold or thing. And then eventually I let go of that idea because it would be a feat of its construction to make an inflatable of it. And the tailoring would be so great because I didn't want to use any print. And then I didn't know what to do. And then I couldn't acquire the log. You know, I asked to buy it. First I asked to take a mold of it. And no, I couldn't. So eventually I just took it. And in order to take it, I had to cut it up into, you know, just hundreds of pieces with a big fireman's chainsaw, you know. And then with my truck, I would take all these pieces to another location in the area and had them piled up there, and then slowly brought them to Los Angeles. And I still didn't know what I would do, but so in my studio, I had this great puzzle of this tree, and I slowly made, to lock it in place, a fiberglass model of it. And in this process of, you know, one-to-one through waste molds, and that took quite a while. And then, you know, it only went back together one way, you know, so I was able to piece all these parts eventually back together. And I thought, well, the very act of making this would be its Pneuma. So I didn't know if I would have these German guys carve it. And I first kind of saw it as a material shift, you know, like carving an oak piece and walnut or something, you know, which is very like Westerman in a sense, you know. And then I went to Japan, because in Japan, they have this sensibility and tradition when something gets old and wrecked. They don't have the fetish for the original. They just make a new one. So when an old wooden Buddha starts to decay too much, you know, they'll just copy it and make a new, and it's the same piece in a way. So I talked to these guys in Japan and interviewed a lot of different carvers and wood salesmen, because I would have to get wood. It was actually the wood salesman that introduced me to the carver. And so I thought the intentionality of carving this thing would be its life or its breath. And so I made this great full-scale model, but, you know, it came apart and shipped it all to Japan. I mean, it came apart so you could see into the chamber. And anyway, it took many years, and became a way of life for me, in a way of, and I just didn't know how to end it. And, you know, I was going to Japan, and it was being carved. So the whole internal chamber is carved to an equal intensity as the exterior. And I always thought of the internal structure as theological in a way. So, you know, when you would, this is where it was initially shown, and when you'd see it, it had this pictorial quality in the room. And it was like immovable in my mind from the meadow I found it in. I always thought, well, how am I going to remove this from the metal? Not just without the whole thing falling apart, but how am I going to remove it and leave the pictorial quality behind? And I think it did it. I think it brought this kind of meadow in with it. And then when you came up closer to it, you started feeling its sculpturalness, not its pictorialness. Great kind of kinesthetic movements of the cracks which run through it and are splitting it, and it's wanting to fall apart. And then when you get closer to it, it becomes, not until you get right on top of it, it becomes monumental, because you see all the different hands that worked on it. You know, you see like a Monday morning where someone's like pissed that they have to be at work, you know. You see someone really good, you see someone bored, just kind of hacking away at an area. And it as a composite object, in a way, it slowly brought in this breath into it of its you know, the nature of its making, in a way. And you know, I didn't know how it would be in the room. And initially, you know, because it was rotting into the ground, the tree had developed a kind of arc. So one end would sit at another end, and all the dirt had been removed from it because the bottom was rotted. Now, how I initially thought, because the floor has always been very important to me sculpturally, how would this suspend itself? And Yubaku said, oh, you know, it will collapse. It will sit that way for a while, but eventually it will collapse. And I said, well, what would you do? He said, well, let's go to the Miho Museum. I'll show you some solutions. There's this Buddha that they have on these granite blocks, rest it. And I did it. And at that moment, I didn't go for granite. I went for the same wood, and we made these blocks with wedges. But it was Yubaku's idea to put it on blocks, and the whole thing shifted away from me and became, I think, a Japanese work of art in a way. And it left Japan, but I see it, you know, it was very hard to finish. So, you know, I see different spaces in it. The space of the outside underneath the blocks and around it, when you walk around is you know, what architects call the space. It's just what, you know, we think of as this design space that we're in, furniture's in. And I saw a theological trajectory into the inside, like who would see in there. And I thought, well, God, you know, I don't believe in God, but as a thought experiment, I do, in a sense that, well, you know, that's a trajectory of the theological, in a way, of a philosophical embedded space that's, in a sense, we're not excluded from, but it's the armature of everyday space, in a way. And I couldn't finish it, you know, and or bring myself to finish it, or how to finish it. And I asked Yubaku at one point, I said, well, what is the life, what's going to happen? He said, well, you know, and Hinoki is quite beautiful wood because it slowly darkens. When you go to the museum, you see these dark Buddhas, and you know, the wood has aged, and it's a dark, dark brown. So this slowly gets darker and darker and darker with time. But he told me that it will be fine for 400 years, and it would just get darker and darker and harder and harder. And then the wood will go into a crisis for 200 years and be splitting and just misbehaving. And then it will be good for another 200 years after that. It will settle down. And then it will just collapse after that. And then that allowed me to finish it in a way. I said, okay, well, this has another life, a life of its own. It's time just to let it go away from myself, in a way.
I think about this work a lot. And you said something, you said you love the fact that this work passed through people's minds. You know, it went in through the eyes and hands of the Japanese woodcarvers and then back out again. So, you know, that's
intentionality, in a way. You know, and when Yubaku sent me samples, I went there, then I sent him chunks of fiberglass things that I had done, and I got back, I wanted it in a harder wood. But he sent me back hinoki, which is a sacred wood, but some sample carvings, and I just hated it. I thought, oh, fuck is this? You know, it's just looked like plastic. You know, it was almost like basswood or something, and I realized, well, then you know, the form has to carry the piece, not this kind of materiality relationship, you know, between the oak and another wood. It had to be strong enough that the form and the intent, like you said, the intentionality of the I mean, it's not made of wood in a sense. The wood is a carving material, but it's made of intentionality of carvers. You know, people looking at and it
Could a robot have carved this? Could a robot arm have?
No, people carved it.
In that theological space, the interior, which is carved to the same degree of detail as the exterior, which only God can see, I think you said, also really transfixes me. And it's something that I saw, if we can go to the next slide, this work Tractor. I think I saw this the first time I met you when I was in San Diego. And I think it was laid out, all the parts were laid out on the floor, and they're not cast. How are they shaped? They're aluminum.
Well, it's cast.
But the thing that, so on the side of the motor there, you can see an alternator. And as I recall, this was laid out. There was the pulley, there was the rotor, there were the brushes, all the parts that go inside of this sort of nondescript cylinder were made and then fit together. And it was inert. It was almost like, you know, what you imagine how machines make, they say after an atomic blast, you know, wires will no longer collect electricity. All kinds of machines will just be these inert lumps. But you know, that sort of thoroughgoing thing where you casted the insides of the insides of the insides of these things, then you cover them up so that no one will ever see them. You even talk about welding parts together so that, because if a collector or somebody who owned this knew that was in there, they would keep taking it off and showing it. So there's a sort of secret life inside of this thing, which you know, all I can think of is like the Egyptian pyramids. You know, there's this secret chamber in the inside of it. But anyway, that's my sort of fan love for this work.
To make a transparent object, you know, so you would look at the exterior of it and somehow intuit that it was consistent straight through, you know. It's like a philosophical object in a way. And, you know, it began with to sculpt a jungle gym. And as I thought of a jungle gym as our first civic space. And I just couldn't you know, I was having genre difficulties and moving into it always looking like a minimal sculpture rather than a jungle gym is what I'm trying to say. And I had remembered that I used to play on a tractor when I was a very young boy, you know, when I was 3 and 4, climb on this old abandoned tractor and use it as a jungle gym. And I tried to remake that and had started trying to make it from my memory and had some ideas about space, like how it would sit in the world, what type of, you know, would it sit as a sculpture, as a picture, you know. I won't go into all of that at the moment, but a friend of mine told me about a tractor out in the San Fernando Valley that 1961 went into a backyard of a then kind of you know, American Dream neighborhood. It blew a rod. It was going to pull out a tree stump or something. It blew a rod, and there it stayed. You know, no one could remove it. People kind of tried to cut it apart over the years, and gave up. And it just kind of deteriorated in this yard as the neighborhood deteriorated around it. It was almost like a clock for that deterioration. And I looked at it and offered the homeowner some money and bought it and craned it back, you know, onto a truck and put it in my studio and took it all apart. all of its inside and outside pieces, and had a team of modelers in clay, made every part in clay and took molds of it. And again, like Hinoki, but different, there were all kinds of different hands, were poetic hands, anal hands, lazy people, really tight people. And I kept thinking, well, how is this all going to go together? And so I started assigning different parts to different people where it was almost going to be like a poem, you know, it went together. None of that really went because, well, anyway, yes, it is consistent right through it. And its mirrorology, or its compositeness, I didn't really understand at the beginning, holds it and locks it together. You see its total gestalt. Like when you first go in a room, you think it's a real tractor, maybe sandblasted. Then you think, oh, maybe it's a mold of a real tractor, you know? Then you realize it's a loom. Then you realize there's a slow unveiling that every nut and bolt are handmade. And each nut and bolt and piece of hardware on it is made by a different hand. And it's like a tractor in heaven in a way. And, you know, again, I think you were referring to, there was an access, a little port that was broken open, and you could kind of see into the internal mechanism of the side of it here. And one of the last things I did was put a cover on it and weld it in my fabric. Say, why did you do that? No one's ever going to see in there. And then what you were referring to, I said, well, people can see in there. That's all they're going to see. You know, but I wanted you to see in there, but I wanted you to see in there as if the object itself was transparent. You know, that you would see through this kind of heavy aluminum mess in a way, you know. And it was, you're right, my mental space in a sense. And it's, you know, quietly full of decisions as well. You know, of it's not just a one-to-one rendition, you know, there are things about it that are, you know, it's as many parts that are on it, there are decisions, you know, that were made over the years about how it would go together. There was once a whole ground sculpted around it that then just became the mud on the treads.
Diorama. Well, continuing this exploration of space, you know, Hinoki reaches off. It's an amazing kind of space invading kind of sculpture, and this has its own kind of intrinsic internal spaces embedded within it. And I have a great quote from you where you say, sculpture is not objects if it's a good sculpture. You were talking about interior and exterior. One thing I think you can learn through sculpture is that there is no difference between interior and exterior. That's an illusion in a way. It's psychological. It's a psychological perception if your thoughts aren't physical. That to me is a very sculptural realization. It comes from years of thinking about interior space, exterior space, pedestals, bases, and how to embed a work in the world. How is a thought embedded in the world, or a perception? Does the object come first, or does the perception of the object come first, the identity of the thing? And, you know, the very first slide of the young man, you know, I think it's important that that weighs many thousands of pounds. That's part of it. It's a solid sort of ingot of a figure. And, you know, that philosophical aspect of your work is something that really intrigues me. And I'd like to kind of get at some of that headspace. And maybe one way to do that is your daily walking practice. I've read that you get up at 4:30, you have a route through Los Angeles, oftentimes in the mountains. We spoke the other morning, it was early morning here in London, and it was still dark out. I think it was 4:30 or 5 in LA. But just you mentioned that, well, you know, what I think it was in your interview with Will Self, you mentioned that when you're walking in a city or in nature and you see something extraordinarily beautiful or poignant or funny, it's just for you. And this is, I guess, walking alone. And how does that feed into your work as a sculptor, moving through the world like that?
Well, I started walking for health reasons. I had some heart issues, and the walking helped quite a, it's the one thing that really helped as much as the medicine. And it just became, I still do it for health reasons, but it also is a beautiful thing to do. I mean, every city that I'm in, I have a different walking route. I had one in Houston when I would go down to the meadow. I have one in Tokyo and New York. Everywhere I go, I walk in the really early morning, because the city is really quiet, or the countryside too, if you're walking like in the mountains and whatnot. And I walk kind of what the hunter-gatherer walked, different routes, but about 10 miles. And it was 3.5 hours. Lately, since my accident, I've been doing a 3-hour walk, and so, slowly building back up. But it's a way to think, as you move. And I think it's embedded in us in a way from our early hunter gathering, early migrations. I think the rhythm of walking is very natural too. And it's not like every step is a thought, but it is in a certain sense, and as you start a walk, there might be a lot of things irritating you in your life, and slowly as you walk, you also build endorphins, and the sort of cocktail of thought and endorphins make some problems sometimes seem less important in a way. And usually, by the time you get home, it feels pretty good. And you see just there's just interesting things changing out. I have a similar route or same route every day. You see changes very slowly, and that's kind of interesting. And, just what you hear early in the morning, there's still a soundscape in a way at that, or a more distinct soundscape. There's always a soundscape, but it turns a little bit more into white noise as the morning wears on, right? But early, you hear distant, noises, footstep. You come across people, not too many, but a few. But yeah, no, it's a really nice way to think, I think.
Let's show a couple more slides of earlier works. These are all works from the 80s, the late 80s. And maybe they're quite different in spirit from the newer work, which deals with a kind of realism, for lack of a better term, a realism which isn't necessarily realistic. But maybe we could just kind of talk about these works, which I know are pretty well known, but could you maybe describe them and how that kind of thinking has changed over the years into the newer work?
Well, I think the sculptures have developed, perhaps the impetus or I guess that has developed too. But this is called Inkbox, and it's a black lacquered box, 3 feet by 3 feet, filled, the top is mitered, and it's filled to the brim with black newspaper ink, and creates a illusion of solidity, like it's a McCracken or something, or one solid minimalist cube painted black. But that was, in a certain sense, with the title and then word of mouth, which I knew that the illusion is a trope in a way, just to bring you to in front of it. And I meant that illusion not to be, you know, the nexus of the work or the meaning of the work. I don't really care about the illusion, but it's enough of an event that the event is you know, generally people just want to touch it, even though they know it's ink. And, you know, ink is maybe the dirtiest substance on, it's newspaper ink, and it dries by absorption, meaning it's just oil and carbon. There's not a solvent in it, you know, so it basically doesn't dry, you know. Sort of when you read the Sunday paper, when you used to read the Sunday paper, you would get ink on your hand. You know, your hand would be blackened a little bit after reading the whole paper because, you know, you're pulling the ink out of the newsprint in a way. But so, you know, viewing it was a little bit like speed in front of a campfire in a way. You know, you also wanted to disrupt it, to touch it.
How about ink line, the next slide? Same substance.
Yeah, it's ink, and it's a hole in the ceiling and a hole in the floor, and an unbroken line of ink falling, you know, because ink has a kind of a thickness to it. So there's no string or anything, but there was an illusion that it was like a string, but very quickly, you know, getting up close, you see something happening with it. And once you knew it was ink, you wanted to put your hand in it, you know, and it becomes a huge mess very quickly. I thought of it as a figure in a way, you know, as the vulnerability of having a body. You know, it's temporalness and aliveness in a way, and the kind of impossibility of a system there's no perfect system in a way, or the impossibility of a perfect system. But yeah, so, you know, there was a pump under the floor in the basement, and then on the roof another vat, and, you know, a kind of mechanism to get that to happen.
And the next one, spinning spot.
This developed into eventually rotating circle. And then I changed it. I showed it at Matthews and slowed it down quite a bit. This was, I think, at Feature Gallery in Chicago. And I wanted to, it's spinning so fast it appeared to be stationary. And I wanted to kind of put all my young man's angst into one location, just dump it there. I wanted to make something so abstract it became real, or so real it became abstract, you know. And I guess the problem, one thing I was thinking, it had this real danger, like if you stepped on it, you'd go flying. And it wasn't that bothered me, but I wanted to make something much purer, and it you know, I wanted to remove the location. And eventually it became 9 inches. This is, I don't know how, 20 inches, you know, and it became mounted at head height in a wall. And the same, not the same piece, but development from it as a way to remove, you know, to purify it, to remove its location.
And the next one, tabletop. And maybe Uri Geller figures in this.
A little bit, I guess. Yeah, it was this thinking about mind over matter, like if you could move something with your mind. And I tried, I never was quite able to, but I remember staring at a table for a long time, at some objects on it, and trying to see if I could move them with my thoughts. And of course I couldn't. And so I mechanized it, and then it developed slowly into a sculpture. The most difficult part was the still life, actually. But if you look underneath the table, it looks like a bomb a little bit, with all these wires and mechanisms and blinking little red lights. But they all move almost imperceptibly, slowly. You can kind of track the plant, and if there's like a speck of dust on a plate, you can kind of see it move. They move very, very slow. I used instrument motors, and then even moved, to turn those down. But you can see them move slow. If you look, you have to give the piece a lot of time and stand in front of it. But
yeah. Let's go to the next slide, which this is Reclining Woman, a more recent work of 2018, back to the figure and realism. And maybe this is a little bit like Spinning Spot, because I remember seeing that at MoCA, and you're looking at a wall and you can see, this sort of sand finish or the brush stroke of the paint or a little bit of the plaster coming through. But then there's this blurred out circle, and there's something similar going on in this figure, which I also saw in some state of completion in the studio. And we were talking about the toes, and there's I wouldn't say it's exactly woozy making, but there's almost like a varying depth of field in this. Some aspects are picked out and very, very sharp, and others are generalized. And it's, you like to think that your eyes pick up every detail, but maybe it's a closer thing to perception. But why this shift in focus and in detail
through the piece, you mean?
Yeah, throughout the piece.
Yeah, because it's a really, the figuration is an entrance in for me to an abstraction. I'm not really interested. I'm not naive to the art historical, the kind of triteness of the reclining naked figure, and additionally, I had like a little cereal box type of figure that was on my kitchen windowsill for years, and I used to look at it and wonder if I could ever make a sculpture of it. And the reclining nude figure, I'm not naive to, it's art historical references. And I used to look at this little Cracker Jack figure on my windowsill in the kitchen when I had breakfast, and it was kind of a blue plastic, maybe from the 50s or something. And I just wondered about it, like if it could be a door somehow, I didn't know how, into a figure, into a sculpture. And so what you're looking at here, she's solid stainless steel, and the base is, this is important, the base is solid stainless steel too. She's machined, not cast or carved. But so I had this little figure, and then one day a lady came to the studio, a banker, my banker, and was just having Sylvia and I sign some papers and do some things, and she excused herself to go to the restroom. And I told the Sylvia, I said, what do you think? Do you think we could use her for a model? And do you mind if I ask her? And so Sylvia said, no, not at all. And she came back and I asked her and she agreed. So she was my banker. And that's how the work began. And it took a long time to make, but she is nearsighted, So when she took off her glasses, which I didn't know at the beginning, she squinted to see you, which brought a kind of interesting level to the sculpture, and that she can't see you, in a sense, looking at her in a way. And her toes are involuntarily curled. And I started trying to find the armature of this sculpture. Everything has an armature. And I tried finding the armature, like where would it be? It was this kind of and the toes are involuntarily moved, curled a little bit. And so I tried to find a kind of line, a nerve from the toe to her nearsightedness in a way, that would run up through the entire sculpture. And that was kind of guiding slowly over the years, the sculpting of it. And she's in motion.
Go ahead, Charlie.
No, it's okay.
Do you ever think about those artists like Rene Magritte or the German Neue Sachlichkeit or New Objectivity artists who use the kind of straightforward realism to talk about the uncanny? And I know you're not interested in the uncanny, but you know, the kind of realism isn't necessarily the point. It's a sort of I don't know, sugarcoating or something to take you into a deeper understanding of things. Do you ever look at painting? I know you look at painting, but do these sort of modern capital M realists who are aiming for something different, do they inspire you at all?
Well, good question. I'm not really, maybe. I couldn't jump into that, readily. So I don't have a answer really to it.
But it is the reclining, it's the odalisque, but it's something different. And that, you've talked about, you use this great phrase, I don't want my work to arrive on a psychological surfboard. You don't want it riding in with this sort of preformed, uncanny, charged meaning, but yet this is, a major motif in the history of art.
Well,
How does that?
I thought was interesting in a way. The reclining figure as a starting point.
Can you say where you were trying to go from this starting point? Or you don't know, it was an exploration?
Oh, I was interested in, and I couldn't say in one particular aspect of it, but and as the work progressed, interest changed. As I slowly progressed, like it didn't begin on the base; it began on the ground. Almost like a sunbather, if you will, and that for obvious reasons. The scale of it and the weight of it came later. It started really with this little figure, and how to pull that up out of the toy and how to bring that up into the world in a way, and it kind of intuitively really interested me. Then these different aspects, I had to work with her gesture, her nearsightedness. I thought was interesting. Because she couldn't see you could see her, and that wasn't a peeping Tom or voyeurism kind of thing, but it, I thought, kept her from being violated in a certain sense.
You've talked about scale and size not necessarily being linked, and this little Cracker Jack figurine becoming, life-size sculpture.
Because the figurine, then I got a model, so it wasn't really blowing up this little figure, or I wouldn't have gone through the stage of a human model, which I took scans and pictures of, and made foam. But spent really a lot of time on aspects of the gesture, the involuntary movement of the toes, forming a kind of armature between her nearsightedness and the curl of the toes. Different gestures within it, and I don't know. What do you think of it?
What do I think of it? I think of solidity. Yeah, it's somehow it's very much kind of from our time. I can't put my finger exactly on it, and I did get sort of, it was a forest for the trees thing for me, where I was looking at the space between the toes with you, and you know, just this shifting in in detail and resolution throughout it was mesmerizing. And I think I got a little, you know, I skittered over the surface of it and couldn't get to the depth. That was my response at the time when I was in front of it. I think that's a bias. I get kind of fixated on the gestalt of things and often have a harder time getting beneath the surface. Should we, I think we're running a little bit long. Should we skip to the last images, the Great Eleusinian relief, and talk about that?
You want to go through the others fast?
Sure, yeah, let's do that. This is the new Beetle, another figurative work. This one is white, another stainless work. Why the white? You know, you think immediately of classical sculpture.
Well, originally, the car, which still has great detail, but the car had an interior, the new Beetle, and it took a while to figure out what toy to use, but it was painted like hyper realistically as a toy, and the boy was almost like a ghost, you know. And then eventually, I closed the car in, you know, kind of commandeered the space immediately into the toy. It was one of those cars with a plastic interior or whatnot. All that was sculpted. The car was sculpted in a different level of detail than the boy, and he was initially almost like a ghost, and the car was more real. And that slowly changed to really an other idea about the plane of the floor. But anyway, you don't have to linger on it if you want to move to.
Then, you know, also back the figure, you know, you started early on using your own figure in these famous two photographs, Planck piece 1 and 2 of 1973.
Yeah, that's interesting because you know, for the new Beetle, before I found a model, I used my own body to feel my way into the pose, you know, how it would be. You know, for a while I was sitting cross-legged with the truck. For a while it was not a car, but a tractor trailer type toy, you know, and I use my own kinesthetics or feeling of my body to work that pose out. And so I just bring that up in relationship to these. The boy of the new Beetle is on I was really interested, as I am here, in the wall and the floor, that thing. I was interested in the infinite plane of the floor of the new Beetle. Like that boy, you know, where he was going to go, where was he from, you know. He goes back to Troy, he goes forward to the future, you know. The plane is really important in that sculpture. It's infinite in a sense. And here the juncture between floor and walls is kind of.
Can you still conjure up that kind of magical endless space of playing with toys? You know, you like Klaus Oldenburg's work, and I think he never lost that power of imaginative projection where, you know, a leaf floating down the gutter could be a sailing ship.
Yeah,
Do you?
But the new Beetle, I was thinking more of the eventually the plane of the floor being infinite, social plane, and then his kind of ultimate vulnerability. The plane aspect of it was like the fire truck, I mentioned earlier, or it's or the reclining figure. I'm not really interested in reclining naked ladies. There was something else sculpturally I was interested in there, and I'm losing my track, but the boy I was interested in the plane really of the floor being infinite and social in a sense.
And these plank, the civic, and you talk about your work being civic. You're very interested in the social, and you don't talk about public art. You talk about civic sculpture that's meant to take a place in society and play a role there.
Those are my thoughts on the civic were from generally failed commissions or commissions that people couldn't stomach once they asked for it.
Yeah. Reading Calvin Tompkins' piece on you in the New Yorker, you hear about a famous failed commission for the Whitney, which is an amazing work that also I saw a version of that in the studio. With these plank pieces from 1973, you say you knew about Richard Serra and his prop pieces, but you were kind of going for something else. And what was it? And was it excruciatingly painful to get in these poses?
Well, I wouldn't say excruciatingly painful, but it was a question where they ended up, in a sense, being documents, like poster size, and it was about me and relationship to the wall and the plank. This you can see some eye bolts in the wall there. I was trying different things. There was a corner over here, and I was just doing different relationships with materials in my body and my body, and trying to find a relationship. I thought these up in I had a big claw iron bathtub, and I would lay back in it and think about the junctures in my body, the joints, and I had this plank I was using, and how things would fit together, what kind of relationship I could form. And I was very adamant when I made these. I was a young man, and I would say, people would look at it and go, "Oh, Jesus Christ, man, that must have hurt." And I would say, "No, it's about a relationship between my body and a plank and a wall." And I refused to look at the empathetic aspects of them. Now they look kind of Goya-esque or something. But and with time, I think the most interesting thing about them, in a weird way, is how they continue to work. They're still out in the world, and not that they're great, but they were just a moment for me in time, and they still are out there, like working for me in a way.
And Self-Portrait of 1990. Was this the work you made to kind of irritate a colleague at UCLA?
Oh, yeah, that just was the initial start of it, where I just had a kind of funny idea. I had an enemy at my university where I was teaching, and I thought if I went into the store and all the mannequins looked like me, it would push them over the edge, kind of. And it was just a kind of marijuana fueled thought or something, the paranoia. But it's called Self-Portrait, and how it was made is I took a generic low-end kind of Kmart type mannequin and had the company who made them lob its head off, and they made a mold of mine and then genericized it and put it on the mannequin, and I dressed it in new clothes, but the way I was dressing at that time. And I think what's important to, it's called self-portrait, and you might see a bit of my gestures in it, but it's not a bad sculpture of a person. It's a sculpture of a mannequin, you know. So that's what I think is interesting about it to see as well.
And then Yes and No, these are famous works. Yes, of 1990.
Yeah, this started as a work called, if you go back to Yes, it started as an abstract work where it was called From the Subjective to the Objective. And it was the same size frame with a circle, like rotating spot, was cut out of the glass. And I had painted the paper that was framed in that circle the same kind of tone as the glass. And I just was working with it for a long time, and it never really quite worked. And it slowly developed into this, which is Yes. You can see that the wall is bent, bowed out, 1 foot in 10 feet. And then the frame was made with a bow, and the glass was bowed, was, you know, heated and bent in its fabrication. And it was a portrait of me on LSD. And so I was trying to push, initially it was called From the Subjective to the Objective, but this was, you know, I was trying to push, this is when it was an abstraction, but in this, I was trying to push my subjective state out into your space in a way. So my hallucinatory space out into the world. And kind of what happened is when you looked at it, it wasn't obvious that this wall and I was bent, but that the side walls were bent, you know, and they started to breathe. So I was just trying to take, not just, but I was trying to take my subjective state and push it out onto the viewer's state in a will. And I titled it Yes, because that was the Just Say No campaign of the early Reagan years. And
What
you
about?
know, hallucination is always an affirmative. Delusion is the negative.
So is No a delusion?
A little bit, huh? And it's funny that I saw that you had put these together. I didn't object, but I try not to show them ever together because then they become a didactic, you know, relationship to each other. And this is a portrait of, obviously, of me, but it's a dummy, you know, it's fiberglass. And kind of an infinite regress in how you can never get to the subject through the media was always standing in the way. So this is a fiberglass dummy version of me. And it's kind of how it felt like to be me at that time. But that's only, it's not a portrait of that. It's a structure in a way. That, you know, first you have to move through the genre of like employee of the month type photograph. Well, it's bigger than that, but you know, Kmart maybe would put it up high or something of their manager, their best employee or something. And then you move through that, you have, you know, another, you know, you just have an infinite amount of veneers before.
Right. And then let's talk about two much more recent works. Two Horses of 2019. This is granite. I've not seen this work and wonder where it is and what it is.
If you go back to the other picture, it's at the Metropolitan Museum. They acquired it, and it's granite relief. So it's a big piece of granite. There's a lot of lines that run through it that are in the granite. And in different lights and in different senses, sometimes it's hard to see the second horse, and sometimes it's very clear. I think that other picture you showed is clearer, and sometimes that horse retreats, the second horse behind this horse retreats into the shadows of the stone, if you will. I was trying, instead of to go pictorially across the stone as a pictorial plane, I was trying to go into the stone in a way. And so I was interested in how the second horse slowly and quietly emerges out of the, yeah, you can sometimes, here you can see him more clearly, but you know, horses stand like that together, and the other is, and all this, you can kind of see the texture, the grain of the marble, or excuse me, the granite.
How did you do that?
Well, I made it, it's pretty big. I made it and I had an idea. First, it was almost like a Serra-esque idea of these two forms, you know, smashing into each other, like one holding the other against the, you know, on the plane. And I made a small version and scanned it, and I'm actually looking at it now, but I like the clay version, and I made it in clay. First carved it in foam, and then laid the clay on it, and told my assistant, you know, from there we were going to carve into the clay. You know, I thought like a few years of sculpting. And once the clay was put on, I said, I'll just leave it, you know, just leave it unfinished, just this kind of quiet quality where parts of it disappeared in a way. And I looked at it for a year, long time, and I was going to make it in aluminum, different things, and I grew to really like its unfinished quality and the way the second horse was disappearing at times into the plane. And I've been doing some stonework, and eventually I got this thought that I would carve it in granite. It's quite big in a way. What is it? Do you know how big it is? It's, I don't know. It's like 12 feet by 9 feet or something. And but you know, I really interested in the direction, not across the marble or the granite, but into you know, going perpendicular directly into it. And
And finally, let's talk about the great Eleusinian relief. Is this?
yeah, because we're running out of time, I'll talk briefly about it. This is a copy of a piece at the Met, which the original is in Athens, and it's the great Eleusinian relief, and it's these goddesses, Kor and Dimitri, giving, can't pronounce his name quite right, but I had it all written out where I could pronounce it, but I'm not even going to try. Grain, the gift of grain, and it's a piece I look at a lot, or was looking at a lot at the Met when I would visit. And what interested me, what they have at the Met is the Romans made a copy of the version, the original, which is in Athens. And that broke apart, you know, in the, you know, years and years, you know, hundreds of years ago. But what was surviving was 10 fragments of the Roman copy. And to make this thing seeable or valuable, in the 19th century or sometime, they took a mold of the original and they inserted the marble Roman copy in its proper location. So what the Met has is this very interesting hybrid object in that there's two styles. There's the style of the Roman fragments and the style of the Athenian original, coexisting on the same plane, except, you know, one is the Roman is marble and the Greek is plaster because it's a copy. And so I've always been interested in this as a hybrid object and looking at these two kind of separations in time of, you know, a couple hundred years or more, and the relationship between the Roman style of the copying and the original of the Greek, and they're distinct but subtle, but distinct. And at a certain point, I thought it would be interesting. I was interested in this as a hybrid object, but it would be really interesting to then make a copy of the hybrid to bring a third cultural relationship to the relief. And so I machined it out of aluminum, which brought the bedazzlement, I think, back, which the Greeks often talked about. But you can definitely see throughout it robotic decisions and the hand of the robot running through my version of it. So, and you still see the, you know, where the fragments are and then the original. And so it is kind of three cultures make, you know, the hybrid object of three different cultures, the Greek, the Roman, and our current culture. And it's Dmitri giving this figure, Chepakalikos, I can't pronounce his name, grain, which then he distributed. That's the gift. And they don't know what she is core is pouring into his head, but she's doing something into his, in his head. And it's beautiful. I've clocked how long it takes me in the version, the original version interested me, and the version at the Met really interested me is, you know, how you move through it and the time it takes to move around and in this work.
You've got a show opening in January 2022 at the Met. Will this work be in it?
Yes, it will. It will.
Will it be in your show or in the permanent collection gallery?
Will be where it is, but this will be in my show. Then if you go to the last slide, which is interesting, it's a little hard to see, but you see where the Greek version of this work came from. And you can see, except it's reversed. It's instead of the boy getting the grain, it's Pandora being animated and made to other gods, Athena, and I forget his name, but you know, Pandora, the first created woman, or she is really made almost like a android set upon the earth for the Prometheus is giving us fire, you know, for he's stealing fire from Zeus and then humankind taking it. And Athena on this side. So it's the same, they think this is where this composition of the relief came from. And you can see the two, a god and goddess instead of two goddesses standing on either side of Pandora. And the Greeks thought of life as a substance that, you know, animated. And you can see the hand is very similar in composition to the relief where so it ends up in the great relief, you know, not because they're animating the boy, but because it's copied from a work 50 years earlier from this great drinking cup, or speculated as being copied from it. But I find that an interesting series of objects, really.
Is this back to Pneuma in a sense?
It's difficult because when we use the word Pneuma, it's almost like there's this concept that's connecting, or that these works are linking together, that it's this thing that we're holding up. And I think what's really artful and interesting is how this developed into the relief, and isn't just because it was copied or it was an archetype, but what a work's relationship to its culture is, and how no one aspect of it can be separated. You can't say the Great Illusion relief is just a copy of this.
I see. Yeah.
But definitely, it's tentacles of before and after, and I mean, how, and it isn't like a connective tissue that I'm talking about either. It's there's an animation that exists between all these works from the past to the present and into the future in a way.
Passing through minds again, like Hinoki, and ultimately through, those human-generated algorithms of the, I guess it would be a milling machine for your version.
Yeah, and as I said earlier, that artwork itself is, to say it's a machine is really wrong, because maybe a machine falls out of it, but it is like a meaning machine in a way that, you start asking what is artful about a work and what connects works together, and why does it, like the Kuros, still work today? A friend of mine, Jack Bankowski, calls a young man the Venice Beach Kuros, which I think is really sort of a good name for it. It would almost be what I would retitle it.
I love it. Great. Well, thank you so much, Charlie. I know we've run a little late and we've got a poet waiting in the wings. I'll let the rail team and Catherine decide how to proceed at this point.
Yeah, sorry if we went over. Huh?
No, this is
no.
great.
We've
Really wonderful.
this conversation. Thank you so much, Charlie and Toby, for your generosity today. It's been truly fascinating. Our first question actually came from Tina Barney, who had to leave earlier, but I will read it on her behalf because we do record these and we'll upload it later to YouTube. Tina just wanted to hear you talk more about scale and its optical illusion. So if you want to just talk about that in your work, yeah.
Well, scale is, in a sense, to me, for me, not about big or small in a way, not about, something being miniature or something being oversized, but it's measured with a psychological yardstick rather than a physical one. And it's like one would choose a material for a sculpture, which would be very important. One might choose a color, a type of focus, but scale is just in the mix as it's a substance in a way. It's an element. It's not, you don't make it big so people can see it from further away. There's one proper scale to a work, as there would be a proper, material that a work would be destined to have to be a good work in a way. Like a word in an essay, if you will, or like a letter in a word would be scale. The material would be another letter, and you can't separate scale out. It's not a choice. Say, oh, I'll make this one big. I'll make this one small. Oh, not enough money in the budget. We'll make this one, medium size or something. Or we'll change the scale so we can afford it. There's a proper scale to, each sculpture. that can't be removed from it. I hope that answers.
Yeah, thank you so much. Our next question came from Amanda, which I will read on her behalf. Amanda said this: I love that you speak about bringing the sculpture out from the image and leave the pictorial behind. But what draws you to the image initially if the impetus is then to break away from it?
That's a nice question. I suppose the image is, in a sense, intermediate. It's how one puts the experience of engagement of the world, both in its cultural and physical, which these things can't be separated, but your engagement in the world when you process it or put it in your pocket, in a sense, it's an image. And then, but I think really a great painting, the pictorial aspect isn't an image. It's a engaged kind of relationship between the picture and the viewer. But in this case, to answer the question, it can be stored in, for me, in a certain sense, as an image. And then I bring it, it can fit in my pocket, then I can bring it back out and look at it, like read it in a certain sense. And but that doesn't, I'm sorry, that doesn't answer the question. I don't think it's quite true that that's what I do. I'll put it that way. But I think things can pass through imagery, and there's an attempt to, as in emotion, there's an attempt to develop your emotion, to see it more roundly. And I suppose that's what I do with imagery, to try to break the distance between what is image and what is connected to me. I mean, I think we live in a world much more involved in imagery. But
Thank you so much. Our next question comes from Charlie Heiskin. Sorry if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly. I will pass you a mic now. Should be able to speak.
Yeah, that was some time ago. I can't even remember what I was on, how I phrased it, but I had a question about imagery as well.
great.
I have the question here if you'd like me to read it. Earlier, Charlie asked, could Charles talk more about his relationship with the window of imagery?
Yeah.
If you want.
Well, it's a personal thing, but the way I use imagery, or for instance, if I just say take surreal imagery, I always know where I am in relationship to a surrealist work. There's a line between my world and the surrealist world. In an image, if I don't know there's a distance between my involvement and an image. I know the difference between me and what I'm looking at. That's kind of what I'm trying to get at. Trying to get at a closer. One could say, well, that's just a three-dimensional image, a sculpture, and a painting is a two-dimensional image. I'm aware of that, but I'm trying to find the reality of my relationship to what I make. So, for instance, in the new Beetle, I'm not so interested at all in the image of a boy playing with a car. That's the image, but it's greater kind of complex relationships that grow around it, like the aspect of how it sits on the floor, the aspect of the plane, of the floor, the plane becoming infinite, the boy's vulnerability. And one that can't be separated from the viewer. When there's not a demarcation or an easy boundary. You can say, well, the boy is just an image of a boy, but there is a real vulnerability in the sculpture. That sculpture is usually out on a big empty floor in a room full of 30 people, easily kicked and broken and destroyed. So that vulnerability becomes in sync with the vulnerability of the image in a way. When I talk about it, I'm just really trying to say I'm not so interested in the image carrying the work, but the structure, and if you will, the structure of the image holding the meaning of the work, or whatever that complexity is.
Thank you so much. Our next question comes from William Udell, who asked me to read it on his behalf. He said, in previous lectures, you talk about sculptures with holes. And here you're thinking of the interior as theological. And he's curious about the distinction.
Well, maybe there is no distinction. I'm not sure. These ways I speak about work is I'm not trying to take anything I said back, but I don't think of them as literal in a way, So I thought a lot about the passage of Hinoki and of the tree, and I looked at it a lot, and there was for many times that I couldn't access it because, when I would go out and look at the log, it was so deep and far away that it had a kind of trajectory to me. It was more than a passage, and I was wondering who could access it. I certainly couldn't. I guess I could if I would have crawled through it. When I was talking at the Menil, I did a lecture on sculpture with holes. I wasn't really thinking specifically about the trajectory of Hinoki. I was thinking about holes, and holes is a way to start to talk about embedment and the space that sculpture exists in. And I guess that doesn't really answer the question, but.
William said that's a wonderful answer. So.
All right.
Our next question comes from a friend and regular here on the New Social Environment, Jeffrey Bishop. I'll pass you a mic now.
Oh, thank you, Catherine. I think my questions have largely been answered, and Amanda's question was at the heart of it. But I'll just say this: I was intrigued earlier on when you referenced the intrinsic and the extrinsic, and you alluded a little bit to the culture at large and to the time of Trump. And if from the material you speak of to the extrinsic, do you have any more comments on that kind of relationship to a cultural landscape, and how we absorb that in the same way that you're speaking about absorbing and perhaps going past and beyond the image, as you've alluded to a number of times today, to something more both concrete and transcendental, perhaps at the same time? I'm not sure I'm wording that very well, but.
Well, I may be like whipping a horse with the way I'm talking or whatever, but I think you can't separate, when I talk about spatiality or embedding a work spatially, it's also embedding it culturally. But first I could see if you can embed a sculpture in space and make it impossible to remove, in a sense, from space, I think the viewer also becomes embedded in space. And I think that's a, interesting proposition in a way to embed your viewer. And I guess going back to the question of imagery, and this might be my problem with imagery. Imagery is a window I look through always, and the structure has been set up for me in a way. And I'm not saying this is that painting is imagery. A lot of sculpture traffics in imagery. There's a pictorial structure that I find like super interesting, and it's the reason I started moving towards reliefs a little bit. But now I'm losing track of what I was trying to say. But yeah, I lost my train of thought. But yes, this kind of I don't think we can, if we're embedded, also separate ourselves or the sculpture, the painting from the culture that it's in a way. And a less interesting work to me isn't embedded, or just is in the flow of the particular milieu in a way.
Thank you.
Welcome. Thank you.
That question. Our closing comments and final question comes from our very own publisher, Fong Bui. Fong, you should be able to activate your microphone.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Toby. This is so invigorating. I feel justified being an artist once again. This is terrific. Charlie, I, having read with terrific pleasure your interview with our dear friend, common friend, Alex Nagel, the Rail consultant editor. It was published in, I think, 2015 in September issue, if I remember correctly, when Alex was our guest critic. And then I remember follow your beautiful 3 lectures at the Menil a year later, and having listened to you just now, describing especially the first sculpture, Young Man, the long enduring process of making it. I can't help but to think of Richard Wormheim's memorable talk. It's called roughly Painting, Metaphor, and the Body, which he dedicated to Titian, Bellini, and de Kooning, part of his Mellon lecture in the mid-80s. And he spoke of how painting, Charlie, acquires metaphorical meaning. I mean, how metaphor itself accumulates on a painting through the making of it, but not through what the making of it means to the artist. You know, so there's always an object that the painting metaphorize. For example, I think at some point he focused on how de Kooning metaphorized the sense of the body through his use of oil paint to evoke the perception of both the kind of sensuality, the infantile experience of touching, smearing, sniffing, sucking, and swallowing and whatnot. In the paint handling fuses those two senses together or subdivides them. Though in most cases, especially those paintings that invoke the presence of the body, the sensation of sense and the activity seem to be combined. In other words, metaphor itself is transfused through the artist's body as it interface with the paint,
Yeah.
with the material. This brings up a question of which you mentioned earlier, scale, largeness and smallness, and how we viewer mediate our senses, our sensation according to its designated scale. Knowing at time our sensation can play all kind of tricks upon scale. Richard, I remember, gave a terrific example when we look to the Himalayas, enjoying the spectacle, the vista. It's monumental. It's vast. But all of a sudden, you have a twinge of pain, and then no literal sense can be given to establishing the ratio between them. In other words, the twinge of pain is nothing, and the view is overwhelming, yet the pain can tower over the Himalaya, So I was thinking about this talk is so special. Thank you so much for doing it. I was thinking how, for example, what is your relationship? We know that you're one of the great reader and contemplator of classical art, for sure. But I'm thinking how phenomenology, structure of consciousness, of intentionality might relate to Gestalt, because there's a Gestalt level in your work. There's similarity, there are continuation, closure, there are figure, ground, symmetry, and proximity. But I also think in relationship to existential condition. And I wonder how the existential condition might relate to the puritanical view of American culture in terms of sexuality.
Huh.
I'm sorry, it's a loaded question, but I want to put it out there.
Yeah, it's okay. I think I see it as a very open question in a way. It's funny because I was recently thinking a lot about St. Gaudens's The Puritan, the sculpture of the Puritan.
Right.
It's a sculpture that would be very easy when a lot of people see it to dismiss it. Oh, it's fucking Puritan. It's, kind of like crappy about, America. But it's quite, for many reasons, a strange and powerful sculpture, beginning with he has this cloak open and it's kind of forming its own space in a way.
Mhm.
But I see it, and I don't 100% understand the question, not 100%, or I've gotten lost out of it or from it from thinking about it. But
Right.
I don't see it as pejorative or like wait this to that, or I don't see.
Mhm.
I see puritanical has a kind of like a tough name a little bit, but
Yeah.
it's just what it is in a sense. And
Mhm.
one of my favorite authors is Daniel Defoe.
Mhm.
He was a dissenter, and isn't because of my interest per se in dissenters or agreement with them or not agreement with them, but with the structures he was able to, invent the novel basically to get his idea.
Mhm.
But it isn't even the ideas as it is the structures that come out. So these, I don't give, I guess I give a lot of thought to my own puritanicalism and to my own upbringing and what I partake in terms of culture, but I never see it really as getting in the way as maybe my friends might have when I was younger or this or that. Not that they was calling me puritanical or something, but these things come up and you don't even, they get squeezed out from different locations, I mean, it's not always as clearly when one's puritanical what they do, isn't so
But
easily.
you know what I mean, Charlie, in terms of puritanical, what Jeffrey was alluding to earlier about Trump, the authoritative figure, we put him there. So my question, in a way, thinking what you have described for this last 3 hours nearly, make me think of your work in terms of painting, Toby. I'm thinking of Charlie's as someone like, for example, if David had created Ankh, neoclassicism, and it was Ankh who really the gift to David. He's the one who really made classicism again, legitimate in that monumental authoritative way. But I'm thinking in the same sense, if you take someone like Andrew Wyeth, you know, and if you if you take Christina Ward in the context, you don't really know how to put her or that painting or Wyeth. Not that I'm a fan, Charlie. Don't think I'm a fan.
Said I put the pink on her dress and I was blown across the room.
or simply Christina trying to crawl up to the hill, the real person, like the way No More No Less than you describe about the person from the bank that posed for you in that odalisque piece. I'm just saying that there's a code of silence that somehow it's very hard to talk about. That's a puritanical aspect that I'm trying to allude at, and somehow it's related to existential angst. That's how I look at your work. It gives me a lot of goosebumps.
Interesting.
Thank you, Charlie. Back to you, Catherine. Thank you so much for
Welcome.
a profound talk.
You're
Thank you.
welcome.
Yeah, I just want to echo that thanks from Fong. Thank you, Charlie, and thank you, Toby. At the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our lunches with a poem. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome our poet laureate of the day, Robert Fitterman, to the stage. Robert Fitterman was born in Creve Coeur near St. Louis, Missouri. Presently, he is writing a long poem by that same name of this town, loosely based on W.C. Williams Patterson. Robert is the author of 15 books of poetry and teaches writing and poetry at NYU and Bard. And I'll drop some links in the chat to some recent publications. Rob, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks a lot to Charles and Toby for that incredible talk. And yeah, thanks, Catherine, and everyone at Brooklyn Rail. As Catherine mentioned, I'm going to read a short excerpt from a long poem in process that's called Creve Coeur. It's a translation of William Carlos Williams's Patterson, which is a long poem that he wrote in the 1940s and 50s. In Williams's poem, the New Jersey city Patterson and its waterfall is the central character. And the text is comprised both of poetic language and something like a repurposed historical documented journalistic kind of language. So mine is a version of that. Creve Coeur, preface. Beauty is not the quest. Creve Coeur, something like broken heart in French, named after a storied romance, a sleepy suburb of St. Louis. To make a start out of fiction and end with the brutal facts of a general American history. Spurious tales have been told about the origins of this name, the impossible love between a French fur trapper and an Osage woman when she leapt to her death off the Creve Coeur waterfall above the Creve Coeur lake. The body of water then formed a broken heart. Really, what other defining myths? Pruitt-Igoe, for example, or a barbed wire property line separating a Confederate history from a one-story, two-bedroom tract house, superior school districts, the popularity of the impala, the stepped ledge of the waterfall, often called dripping springs, is for lovers. But the Creve Coeur waterfall is not at all steep. It never seemed ideal to me or even possible for a suicide, lovesick, or otherwise. A trickle. 1. Schnucks, a giant among supermarkets. This is why I don't do self-checkout. I was at Schnucks with my dad and he was overcharged for like 2 out of 10 things. This happens almost every time we do self-checkout. Dad is a rock, somewhat hard of hearing, occasionally stubborn, so I get it when he insists on using self-checkout, but then I'm the one who has to stand in line at customer service and unload everything onto the counter and convince them that we aren't stealing any products. Ragu was 3 for $5. Dad got 3 and was charged for 4. Chicken sausages were buy one, get one free. Dad got 4 and was charged for 3. It's embarrassing. And to top everything else off, Dad bought a bad batch of cut flowers. And since it wasn't on his Schnucks rewards card, they made him jump through hoops to exchange them. My dad's a sweetheart, but highly principled. And if crossed, he's known to slam a bouquet of chrysanthemums onto the counter while the employees are lost and locked in their desires, unaroused. Say it, no ideas, but in profits. The world shrinks on the blank faces of employees. Once upon a time, I worked at this Creve Coeur store. And once when I was out back for a cigarette break, I set free a shiny gold helium balloon from the dumpster in bubbly cursive. It read, "Best day ever," on one side, and on the other, "Grand opening." A future schnooks, every strip mall like a fresh start. Back then, there was a manager named Zach who wore his hair combed back, and he'd intentionally hide trash in corners to see if I was sweeping properly. I think you missed this area. Zach used to boast that he's worked in nearly every Schnucks location, and he's seen good store management and bad store management, and it usually depended on the area. Zach claimed he wasn't prejudiced, but that the stores in North St. Louis, like in Blackjack or Spanish Lake, just weren't as up to speed as the ones in West County. Everything depended, Zach said, on the neighborhood. Once you cross Del Mar, I don't know, it's a different world. The Del Mar divide refers to Del Mar Boulevard as a dividing line running east to west across St. Louis City and County. In the early 20th century, the St. Louis real estate industry employed a system of racial covenants and steering to drive the city's growing Black population to neighborhoods north of Del Mar while driving white families to the south. Creve Coeur, among other St. Louis suburban counties west of the inner city, is a direct result of this aggressive redlining. To guide incentives, the federal government hired local squadrons of appraisers, brokers, realtors, and other real estate professionals to designate areas as best, still desirable, definitely declining, or hazardous. These areas deemed hazardous were outlined in red. To this day, the St. Louis urban center is hollowed out and has had far less gentrification than we might see in Rust Belt cities like Chicago and Pittsburgh. By the 1960s, many families left, including the Black middle class, heading out to suburbs such as Ferguson and Kinloch, only for the cycle of mortgage denial to repeat itself. A few years back, I helped my parents move out of their small suburban home in Creve Coeur into a small retirement apartment building. The concept of the doggy poop bag for their Cairn Terrier had to be introduced. I offered to go to Krummenacker's pharmacy, not because they are likely to have poop bags, but because the world of nostalgia is greater than Petco. I take Craig Road for the same reason, and then head west past the homes whose futures look bright, whose families have thrived in the Parkway School District. And then past some 70s condo where two grown-ass men are enjoying a driveway lounge, blue Bud Light koozies. Life is sweet, reads one t-shirt. I hate everything, reads the other, likely from the George Strait song, A Kind of Consolation Prize, or as my dad used to say, a constellation prize. Some readers, myself included, often skim over these sections. We see the smaller font and we get the idea that this text has more of a newspaper style patina, and we skip it or skim it. I had this experience when reading William Carlos Williams's Patterson. For me, the smaller font prose section read like an invitation to skim, but maybe I'm a lazier reader than you. Anyway, I hope that you are reading now because I thought it might be useful to write about what I'm up to. My poem, Creve Coeur, for sure, is a loose translation of Williams's Patterson, but I won't trouble you with the concept or process of how I decided to go about this, or how closely I thought to mirror Patterson, or why I was counting syllables, or at least counting number of lines. And then I wasn't, but instead, what does it mean for my poem today to be in dialogue with Williams's poem about an American city written after 1946, and how my suburban experience of Creve Coeur, Missouri lines up with his themes of oral histories, municipal politics, industrial American landscape, language, local psyche, etc. And since the mirroring of Patterson haunts these pages, I'm thinking that the experience of not reading or nearly not reading these small font sections replicates that ghostliness. But then again, as a friend put it, maybe this small font is not really that small anyway, 9 point. He thought the New York Times prints at 8.7. I just looked it up and it appears to be 9.25. Supermarket coupons often print at 7 point Helvetica, and that's readable. On a forum, someone posts, I've used copperplate Gothic light at 7. It's an all cap serif font. Not everybody likes it, I guess, but I thought it looked elegant. It's certainly readable, end quote. I tried it here and I think it looks ridiculous. I'm sticking with Calibri body for its pedestrian quality. Thanks.
There's a roar of applause throughout the Zoom room here. That was great. Thank you so much, Rob.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Charlie and Toby, for today's conversation, for your generosity. And thank you everyone who tuned in today for all the great comments and questions in the chat. And thank you again, Hill Art Foundation, for making today possible. This winter marks the Rail's 20th anniversary. We're celebrating all the way into 2021. So please consider making a year-end contribution to keep the Rail and our special projects free, relevant, and independent, like the NSE Conversation Series and We the Immigrants Project. Every amount matters. And our goal is to double last year's participation and reach 500 donors. I'll drop a link in the chat with more information. Please join us tomorrow for our 200th New Social Environment. That will be at 9 a.m. Eastern Time. It will feature artist and activist Ai Weiwei in conversation with Paul D. Miller, aka DJ Spooky. And we'll conclude with a poetry reading from Irene Arsanios. Again, this is at 9 a.m. tomorrow, and if you can't make it, we'll record it and put it up on YouTube as always. Thank you again, and you should all now be able to activate your microphone if you'd like to say goodbye as you leave. Thank you again, Charlie and Toby. Thank you, Rob, for the reading.
Thank you
Thanks,
so much.
Charlie and Toby.
Thank you, Toby.
Thanks, Rob.
Thank you, Charles. Charlie.
That was amazing.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Toby.
Thank you so much.
Mind blown officially.
Mind bending.
Yes.
Oh, my mind's bending. Absolutely. Thank you so much. Also, beautiful reading, Rob. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank
yes.
you. Thanks for having me.